Intersection Education Podcast. In this episode, I'm speaking with Jodie Mattia. She's an experienced educational leader and doctoral candidate at the University of Alberta, specializing in educational policy and leadership. Her research explores how school leaders conceptualize well-being and its impact on their roles. As Director of Support Services at Wetaskiwin Regional Public Schools, she oversees social-emotional supports and Indigenous programming. With over 30 years in education, as a principal, vice principal, and school counselor, Jodie has shaped policies that support student success and staff well-being. A sought-after speaker, she advocates for well-being, staff engagement, and systemic change in education. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jodie Mattia. Hi, Jodie. How are you today?
Hi, Corey. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Yeah, I'm really excited to actually talk to you about a subject that I'm really interested in, and I think is going to be very interesting for all of our listeners too. And so, before we get into your actual subject, I was wondering, what do you think, or what do you hope one aspect that people will think differently about after hearing this interview? I want to give you a little controversial, or maybe a little sneak peek at the conclusions at the end. What is one thing that you hope people think a bit differently about after listening to our conversation today?
Well, I would hope that they would grant themselves permission in regards to what makes them well, which means shifting what they're focused on rather than busyness, care. And so that would be what I would be hoping, and an understanding of all that goes in to well-being. It's not as simple as it's been made to be.
That sounds great. Now, I would love to hear how we got there. Let's talk a little bit more about your research. I know you've been studying school leader well-being, and I actually feel that there's that term, well-being. It's, I don't know if it's misunderstood, but there's just been so many aspects and so many definitions, and it's been so big. When you're doing your research and you're thinking about well-being, how would you define it?
So that's a great question, Corey, because, my well-being, my question was to understand how school leaders conceptualize well-being. So what did it mean to them? Because you're absolutely correct. There is no agreed upon definition. There's multiple ways to look at well-being. And there's the subjective well-being, and then there's objective well-being, and there's eudonic and hedonic. Like, there's just, you name it. It's the full gamut. And so I took a look in my research to initially start with, because you need to land somewhere with that. It really is the balance between the resources that are available and the challenges that are at hand. And that came out of Dodge's work in 2012 in defining well-being. And so that was really my starting place. And what I learned is that as much as we try to simplify well-being, it's very much a social construct. And so when you say, what is the definition? Well, it varies, and it's complex, and it's really dynamic, and it evolves over time for people. And so when I was a school leader, I would use it as what gives you energy. And so that would be my definition. That's not the researched one, but it's really, what is it that gives you, your personal self, that energy to take on the challenges that are at hand and be present.
Now, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wouldn't mind digging into this more. We're talking a lot about well-being. I'm interested to know how you chose the topic of well-being and especially of understanding well-being in school leaders as a pretty intensive topic. I often think, you're going to give up 4 years of your life getting really into the weeds on a topic, and usually you have to really, really love it. How did you know that wellness and school leader wellness was going to be something that you could maintain that passion for over 4 years?
Yeah, well, it was even a little longer for 4 years than for myself, Corey, and I'm still truly passionate about it. It was that personal and professional connection for myself. So, when I entered school leadership, I could say I was unfortunate to have some really challenging situations come up that tested the resources that I had available because of the challenges that were taking place in my professional life. And so, I thankfully, and then I need to step that back a little bit because my master's degree is in counseling. And so Dr. Chris Diachuk, or the late Dr. Chris Diachuk, when we were doing our counseling work, said you need to have a practice when you're dealing with all of this really, really tough stuff that gives you energy back. And I can't tell you what that is. You need to figure that out for yourself. And so, of course, he had us journaling about it and trying it and reflecting on it because, we're all learning how to be counselors. And so I had, that was kind of the start of the importance of well-being personally that would then influence my professional world. So when all of this took place, I literally sat and stared some days at my computer, and I had a little block beside it that had a saying on it that it said, "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity," which of course is a quote from Albert Einstein. And it was just that constant reminder, regardless of how challenging it is, there's something to be learned. But in order to do that and to have that space available, I need to be able to care for myself, which isn't always easy, which is where I landed in the end in the topic and so it drew me there. I also found that there wasn't a lot of support for myself. I was fortunate to have somebody at central office that was supportive, and I appreciate that I was fortunate for that, because if that individual hadn't been there, I wouldn't have had that support. And so school leaders are kind of left because who's other than the central team, if you feel safe enough to reach out to them, you're the school leader. It lands with you. Where else are you going? So I was like, I'm super interested in learning more about this and really having a better understanding. And of course, research is always tied personally. So I was like, was I the only one that's ever experienced this? And what does it look like? And I want to learn more and understand how else do people engage in well-being and understand it. Do they understand it the same? Because there isn't an agreement on it. So that's what landed me there.
Well, and it comes back. It seems very circular. So I think that our first two questions are good and they speak to each other. But now I'm really interested to find out more about what you actually found. What are some of your big ahas? If you said, maybe let's start at one of the bigger ones. What are some of the big takeaways that you had in your research?
So one of my greatest takeaways was, well, first of all, I learned a great deal because I had this great plan, Corey. So I had developed a conceptual framework that this was my understanding. And I thought this was going to be true. So if you gave yourself permission and someone gave you permission and you set boundaries and you had an understanding of, internal and external tension, so things that were going on, that once you had that, you'd have well-being. Done. Perfect. That sounds pretty simple.
Sounds easy.
Yes, straightforward. See, I gave you a structure. You can just put that in, and if you're given permission, off you go. You can set boundaries, and we hear that often in a lot in medical or like nursing research, but also on many podcasts or in some of the bestsellers. Just set boundaries. Just go ahead and set boundaries, and then you will have well-being. And so I was like, yay, yes. No. My first, and I'd say and it ties back to that first question is, the granting of internal permissions is the cornerstone to actualizing well-being. So well-being, there's so many lists. There's so much information out there on how to be well, what to do to be well, be that healthy, or, it's your list of to-dos. And in the end, it's, are you able to give yourself permission? And there are so many pressures, specifically, there it is, for school leaders. So they have, because of the expectations, they have great guilt if they're going to take time for themselves. They have a fear of judgment, that how will I be seen by my school community, by others, by my supervisors. So there's all of these, which I call tensions, at play that inhibit their ability, that they believe that they can actually give themselves permission to be well. And so that was a huge takeaway, that I went, oh, wow. So we say, yes, go ahead, take the day off. But then you're like, oh, who's going to cover that? Who's going to do this? Who's going to do that? So now you're questioning, should I take the day off? So there's an example of being able to, how it's not simple to just say, oh yeah, give yourself internal permission and off you go. And so that was critical finding. And I don't know, Corey, if you've experienced that, right? Of, oh, I'm going to take a pause here.
Yeah, absolutely. There's guilt, there is expectation. I love how you frame that. It's that oftentimes we know what we need to do or what we need to not do to be well. But will we allow ourselves the permission to do that? I think that frames it really well. I'm wondering, people, I imagine, have different levels of ability to do that. And that might even, like, how they see their job might even change whether they're well or not, how they see their job, whether they allow themselves permission. I was speaking with another person doing some research, and they talk a lot about how that identity of themselves as school leaders really affects kind of how they bring themselves. I imagine that's a lot. You probably found very similar things.
Which was my second finding. Yes. Absolutely, Corey. And it's that role conceptualization. So how is it that the school leader conceptualizes or understands or believes the role of a school leader is? So it's their belief, but then it's also the community and the social belief and expectations around school leaders. And so, more and more, as we were talking about earlier, there's more and more expectations on school leaders. It's not just about leading learning anymore. It is about making sure the mental health, that they have food, that they have clothing, and it's the appropriate clothing, and right, that we're teaching a whole set of skill, and that expectation lands firmly with the school leader, recognizing that. And so the way they see that role, I also speak to that culture that we have in education of continuous improvement. And I'm not against continuous improvement, but when we have continuous improvement, it means we always have to be better. And often as human beings, that means we're going to do more. And so, I observed as a teacher, a school leader, and I thought, well, I'm going to do that, and I would like to see this. And then I go to a session and I hear about that and I add that on. And then I'd like to do something else. And so I myself have built up this conceptualization of a school leader is all of these things. And then because our school leaders are such amazing, caring individuals, they try to do all of that, all of it. And so with that, then they've really set themselves up with, I can't step away. I feel like this is my role. And they take it, which of course we want, and I'm so thankful for, they take it so seriously, and it is part of who they are. I had a conversation with not part of my research, but while I was researching with the superintendent who had retired, and they had shared with me that even as a superintendent, that was part of their identity, and it took them over a year to figure out who they were when they were no longer in the role. So I think even as educators, it really becomes part of who we are, which is one of the things that makes us great at this work. But it also puts a lot of pressure on our physical selves, our mental selves, our emotional selves, so really our well-being, our being itself, because we're so giving. It's acts of service, right? That's most often why we go into this, because, we want to make a difference for kids. We go into leadership because we want to make a difference for kids, and we want to support staff. And so that level of care and empathy make it really challenging to not conceptualize the role in the way we do.
And it sounds like there's a constant balance, because if you don't take on that, well, perhaps your performance might slip.
Right.
But if you take on too much, well, then your wellness slips. And
Yes.
so it's this constant balancing act. And it sounds like that's kind of where you need to get it right. Because if you end up on too much on one side, then you're not going to be well either in your professional life or in your wellness.
Absolutely. And we have a culture, very much so, which I speak to my research. We have a culture of busyness. So we have a role conceptualization, and then we have a culture of busyness that celebrates and glorifies how busy we are. And that has given us and I say us globally, in North America, it's given us status, it's given us self-worth, it validates, I am actually worthy. And so that's the conversation that I would really like to disrupt. So instead of the look at how busy I am, to let's talk about how I'm caring for myself. Let's talk about all of these things I'm doing that are not about how busy it is. And we often, how are you doing? Oh, I'm so busy. We don't even actually comment on, and we don't take time to reflect, to go, how am I doing? Let me take a moment to pause and think about that. I'm so busy. But it really is glorified in our culture, and what we recognize, and we see this as those resources for individuals are depleted, that it's not sustainable. And so that also sounds like it's all on the person, and or on the school leader. And that's another takeaway from my research, is the impact that the system has, and the system of the way the school is structured currently, the way school divisions are structured and education is structured, but also our social structures. Busyness is an example of that social structure that we have in place, or that, the community and community engagement. I am all for it and absolutely love community engagement, but the expectations that community or the social world has of schools, right? So there's all of, like when you talked about that balancing act, Corey, it's so true. There's so much to balance, and there's actually, and I recall this many years ago when I was a school leader, you go into the role thinking you're going to have control. You're going to be able to make plans and do things, and it's, this is great. I get to make change. And then you land in there and you realize, oh, wow, I don't have that control. It's unpredictable. It's not consistent with everything that's coming at you all the time. And so those pieces, influence how it is that you're able to respond. Yeah.
One of the books that I have really enjoyed over the last little bit that you might like is called The Pruning Principle. And that is, what are we going to take away. It really asks, if we're going to take this on, what are we going to leave behind? What no longer serves us? What's not effective? Because I,
Mm-hmm.
like you, have caught myself at times just adding and adding and adding. And at one point or another, we need to look around, we need to evaluate, and we need to prune, which is, all right, we need to take this away so that we can actually get bigger and stronger, or better in our case. So yeah.
I would be really curious, Corey, on how that's going for you.
How is that going for me?
How's the pruning, the taking away going for you?
I love the idea of it. But when you talk about granting yourself permission to do the things that will allow you to be well, I am not as great at that. But I also think that it's an idea that one needs to wrestle with, and it maybe takes some time to put into place. And so I feel like, although I had a slow start, that I may be gaining some momentum on the saying no to certain things, or to leaving certain things that are no longer serving me as well as they could have.
I'm really glad
I'll let you
to
know how
hear
that goes in a couple of years.
Absolutely. I look forward to hearing about that, Corey, because, one of the challenges to school leadership today is the availability. So it's really hard to say no to things, because with technology, you're available 24/7 if you feel that that's the way you've conceptualized the role, is that I need to be available. That's one of the expectations. And that's, again, that system expectation that, yeah, you should be available all the time. Or is the system setting really, really clear policy and expectation around, unless it's something really, really critical, no emails, no text messages, no phone calls between this time and this time, to actually support you giving yourself permission to step away. Because, I can do that. I've done that with my staff before, to say nope, and they're still emailing away, and I'm like, I gave you permission, but they're not giving it to themselves, because, well, maybe that will help. And I appreciate, and that's that individuality around well-being. For some individuals, they feel like, what, if I can get that done, then I'll be able to have time and space for this, and that reduces my stress or my anxiety. But again, it's that balance. Where is it and when is it that it's too much? When have we stepped over the line and we're no longer taking that time away, which is critical, is to be able to, there's all kinds of research on the pause. Viktor Frankl talks about it way back in regards to man's search for meaning, in that, where is it that we have that control between stimulus and response? There is a space, and it's within that pause that we have the opportunity to make different choices, but it's actually where our control lies. And when we're so busy, be it technology or administrative tasks or, we don't have space for that pause. So it makes it even more challenging to say, hey, I actually need to give myself permission to step away, to do this.
Yeah. Now, sometimes people have difficulty conceptualizing, because I think the definition of well-being is so widespread. I'm wondering if in your research, when people are not feeling well, when they're feeling this overloaded, what are some of the emotions that you found, or what does that look like? What does that feel like? What are they saying about how they feel when they're really unwell? Was there any dominant emotions, or was there anything that you saw as a pattern there?
Yeah, and there are, in regards to the participants in my study, I would say the majority of them did a really beautiful job. I'm going to pause to say masked their emotions, which was one of the observations that I made through what they had shared with me. So when you have a day off, I'm going to use an example for you, Craig. When you have a day off, and you need to duck when you go by the school in the vehicle because you don't feel like you should have the day off. You're actually ducking while you're driving by. Like that just says a whole lot. Like I don't know like what are the emotions with that, but it just spoke and continues to speak volumes that you contractually are able to take a day off. We would encourage you and give you permission to take a personal day to go do something. And even when you've done that, you're ducking. Wow. Wow, that's really impactful. And so it was through their narratives that I was like, holy moon. So we've really tried to story the lack of emotion. We don't want to say I'm stressed out, I'm burnt out. Why is that? Well, because does that mean I can do this job? Right? Like there's a level of vulnerability that would be necessary that, leaders, and I really appreciated that I was collecting a lot of data just post-COVID, and they spoke about how we wouldn't tell anybody how we were feeling, right? Because it's too scary. I don't know. Is it safe? Is it safe to do that? Will I be, it comes back to that, will I be judged? Will I be judged for not being strong enough? Because our conceptualization of a school leader, dynamic, strong, has it all together, right? And so, if you're emotional, maybe you're not, right? So there's this cultural piece that comes with that. I would say overwhelmed. I was really thrilled with a couple of my participants that really, all of my participants were amazing, but they spoke about being angry, very angry. And so that's the space and place that they were at, which I appreciated. And it was angry, not at anyone in particular, but I would say at the structure and the state of education today. There was a lot, because education isn't on an island all by itself, which we know this working in this world that, now called Recovery Alberta Mental Health Services, impacts government funding, huge, in regards to the supports that are available for students, which directly impacts staff. And so, they really spoke around that piece in regards to their well-being, but overwhelmed, overloaded, not sleeping. Like it came down to physical aspects. They also spoke about what they gave up and what they continue to give up for the work, be that time with their children, time with their families, time with their friends. You'll notice the theme there. Right? It really is, where is my priority? Am I able to make connections? Which, led to my shall I say, rural component of that loneliness piece. Well, it weaves in that loneliness, but rural, that everybody knows you. You have multi-layered relationships, right? So you have to be aware of who is it that you're connecting with and what are you saying and to whom. And the complexity was really, really evident.
Okay. And so just so I understand clearly, you noticed in your study that sometimes there was additional complexities or maybe different complexities when you were in a rural community versus an urban community. And rural, that whole idea of the social connection, just like you're ducking to get away or go past the school, it's even doubled when you're in the rural community because everyone knows your car and what you're doing, and they wonder, well, why isn't he at school or why isn't she at school?
That's exactly it. So my study took place in my case study took place in a rural school division, considering that there was no large metropolis or urban center. And so there were towns. So it was like much of Alberta, other than our major centers, right? Where we don't have any big cities. And that was very, very evident, Corey. Yeah, that there is a complexity, which is my third finding. There's a complexity and there's a lot of intricacies when you take a look at rural leaders and well-being. And for that exact reason that you just shared, everybody knows who you are, which leads and weaves back to that judgment and guilt and all of those pieces, because it's kind of like you're a celebrity because everyone knows you. And there's lots of strengths. So I'm not slamming working in rural. But that, because I work in rural and have for 30 plus years. So there's lots of strengths, but some of the challenges have a direct impact on school leader, their ability to give themselves internal permission and their well-being as a whole. Because, when you dig into the rural ed literature and the research that's taken place, it does speak to that it's a lonely job. Because you're kind of it, and the community has expectations of you as a leader and as a community member. And so when we talk about that role conceptualization, it also shifts a little in rural education. So all of those layers influence. Can I give myself internal permission, which means I have that space to actualize a sense of well-being.
Now let's turn this around, because I feel like we've been kind of doom and glooming a little bit. Not that that's what you set out to do.
It was
but
not.
It
wasn't. Not even close.
No, we're oralizing the complexities and the difficulties of school leadership right now. I think not only in Alberta, but I would say North America and a lot of places in the world. But I imagine, and you kind of already have hit on these, but I wouldn't mind saying them out loud and clearly, is what recommendations did you find from your research? What recommendations do you have for people for this? Is it simple as knowing, hey, you probably know what you got to do, so just give yourself permission to do it? What other things can we do? Well,
Corey, just go ahead.
I say that because it sounds too easy. I feel like there might be some other things that we could do to encourage these positive choices.
Yes, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. And yeah, it does sound really simple. And it actually puts one more thing on school leaders to do if it's framed in such a way, which of course would not be the intent. So how do we set those conditions for school leaders to be well, which, lands in when we think about policy, in regards to, as I had mentioned earlier, as a school division, the structure of education, what are the policies that we do have in place that can support internal permissions? So how is it that we can encourage and support our leaders to take that day off and them not to feel guilty? Them not to be fear that they're going to be judged, but that it's actually celebrated that they're taking care of themselves. And I would say those are one small act at a time. And I do see a role for senior leadership in school divisions to really model and support that with our school leaders. So, as a soon-to-be superintendent, I see that as one of my roles, and increasing the understanding. So I think, as we talked about that frame and the conceptual framework, so there's, those theoretical implications on, let's actually have the conversation. Let's have the conversation about what are the internal and external tensions that are getting in the way of internal permissions for yourself, for the system. We often talk about well-being, I like to say at a fairly surface level, that's the to-do lists. Here, let's do all of these things and you will be well. Let's have a well-being day as a school division and everyone will be well. No, they won't. great, we can check it off that we did something, but really having those in-depth conversations and not just once. So really shifting the culture, that it becomes part of the culture on, let's talk about the tensions. And internal tensions, the way I define that, Corey, is, kind of what you're in control of. So really what's taking place within yourself. And you might not want to, there's only maybe a couple trusted or a few trusted people that you'd have that conversation with, or maybe for yourself, it's journaling that, right? Like that's so individual. When we take a look at those external tensions that are taking place, that's really a collective conversation. Because we potentially, once we identify those, right, once we name it, we have an opportunity to change it. And so if we're able to name those and we see themes and consistencies, what can we do to address that? Each of us, or collectively as an organization or as a school or as a team, what could we do that would really help support that piece? Those it doesn't need to be complicated, and I think if it is complicated, it won't happen. And so those small intentional acts are really critical. And then shifting our conversations from our checklists, which I've sat for many, many years in regional meetings between school divisions, which I've absolutely loved, and they're brilliant ideas, but we talk about all the things we do, how we're doing our being, right? Not how well, like let's really talk about our being instead of doing, and sort of shift that conversation from the checklist to really the person. How is it that we're supporting? Not, oh, here's all the things we did and all the activities, because each of us needs something different. And that's the, I find that the really cool part about well-being is that there's nothing stagnant about it. It changes and evolves depending on the situation, which was my draw to Dodge's definition, because there's so much fluidity. And she uses a visual for her definition, and it's actually on a fulcrum. Because, yeah, you're right. Like when you say balance, because we've also storied well-being as a problem that we're going to solve. And we're not it's not a problem to solve. It's a social construct. And if we have when I say skill, I don't mean like, let's do a training course, because there's lots of those, but it's something that we continue to talk about globally, but don't dive in and say, okay, so what is this really? Like, let's talk about these tensions. Let's talk about what are the permissions that are in place, and then are we able to, and I truly ask, are we able to set boundaries? School leaders, prior to recording, we talked about duties as otherwise assigned. That statement alone states, as a school leader in your contract, you are not to have boundaries. Duties as otherwise assigned is wide open. And so how is it that we can slowly shift the system so that it's set up, that we have those conditions in place for our school leaders to say, yeah, I'm really important. My well-being is really important. I don't need to feel selfish about that, because when we're well, we do our best work, right? We all know that. It's the oxygen mask analogy, it's the basketball that's blowing up analogy, whichever analogy you want to use. And they sound so lovely, but they're really, really challenging to do in this role, because I believe of the social constructs that are in place. So how do we break down those? That's a big job. How do we break down those social constructs? Policy, for sure. Individually, and us as leaders saying, we need to do this differently. So I love that pruning idea. So what are we going to, could be take away, but also what are we going to shift and do differently? Which doesn't mean we're doing the same and more. It means, what am I going to do differently? What can I do differently as a leader at a school level and at a central level? And then how can we support that through government policy? I find it fascinating. The LQS does not mention school leader well-being. It mentions that school leaders
Yeah.
are to be responsible for the well-being of their school community.
I guess in a stretch, you could say that the leader is part of the school community, but that might be underselling it a little bit.
Well, I've looked at it through all those angles, Corey, and I'd be like, yeah, maybe it is. And so I'd love to tell you I have a magic wand of, here we go. I think also in our preparation courses, as we prepare our educators to be school leaders, that there's a real intentional focus on, having those in-depth conversations around well-being. And they don't need to be necessarily group therapy at all, but where is that reflection for self? And as educators, we're taught from the time we more or less enter the career in regards to being reflective in our practice, in instruction, in the classroom. How did that go? And evaluating all of that. What would I do differently? We don't often then take that opportunity to reflect within ourselves of, how am I doing? And so having that as part of the preparation, because it is everything in education today is fairly taxing, I would say. And as a school leader, it can be a lonely role, but it's also you are the top of the hierarchy at the school. It all rolls up to you. It states that in the Education Act, you're responsible for a whole host of things in regards and ultimately for all that's taking place in the school. And so that's a huge responsibility. That's also exciting. So I don't want to say that it's terrible. And you get to be creative and innovative and supportive. Where's the flip side of, okay, and how are you going to care for yourself? So, having that as part of preparation, I think is really critical also. So that, you'll hear that me share that several times, that intentionality, that we don't just say it, but we dive into it, and help our leaders and our aspiring leaders to understand what's going to work for them now. And, that's an exploration component, because it's not a one size fits all. It's not a checklist. And to understand too that it changes over time. Right.
Yeah.
So
it sounds like you're really talking about, part of the preparation for being a leader is to know oneself. I often think about that comes with time, and know that who we are changes.
Yes.
And then knowing that we'll need different things at different times. I was talking today with my wife about how we are coming up to the 5-year anniversary of COVID. And it's one of those things. Where were you when we started shutting things down?
That was
and
today.
I imagine, was it today?
Today was the anniversary where they shut the world down.
And the needs of people during COVID were probably different than the needs that they had maybe this past year. That doesn't mean that they were, more or less, but I think it speaks to that evolution, and then to the self-reflection, as you were talking about, and the self-awareness to know that, here are some things that I can do that'll work for me right now. Here's what I need. And then, I can do them. I need to do these for myself. I love how you're putting that all together.
Yes, and I appreciate that you say you need to do this for yourself. And now, Corey, I'm going to challenge you to give yourself internal permission to actually make that a reality. Because we can talk about it lots, and that's the challenge. So I wish I said this when I was a school leader, as a director, and even as a counselor. I don't have a magic wand, but I think that awareness allows us to be better. And you summarized that beautiful, that yes, it really, as I like our school leaders are our ultimate caregivers in our systems. They hold the whole system. They hold, a teacher holds the students, absolutely. And the principal holds the school community, the teachers, and the students. and quite often agencies and. And so who's got them, and do they have themselves? Do they know themselves? So that was, really beautifully put, because it really is about knowing yourself and recognizing it changes and evolves, and it takes time. It takes time. So, that pause, taking time to just be, and that's the part of well-being that I love, is to just be, where you're not busy, you're not doing things, you're just being. And there isn't a lot of permission currently in our culture to do that without being judged or feeling guilty. I wasn't doing anything. Oh, but you really were. So, normalizing that would be super positive.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to leave at. Giving everyone listening the permission to just be. Giving everyone listening the permission to do what they probably know they need to do in order to be well. And hopefully they will take your advice and hopefully be a little bit better off for it. And I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your research and probably a little bit of wisdom too, and helping us all out a little bit as we try and navigate this very complex world in complex schools, and hopefully do that and being well at the same time. So thank you so much, Jodie.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Corey.
Thanks for listening to this edition of the Intersection Education Podcast. Please make sure that you subscribe to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes. Another great resource is to sign up for our newsletter on the website intersectioneducation.com.